I ordered the DNA test late at night, during one of those strange, half-conscious internet spirals where you find yourself adding things to your cart that you don't even remember searching for, your fingers moving almost faster than your thoughts, as if something outside of you is making decisions on your behalf. The ad that caught my attention wasn't one of those friendly, colorful ones showing smiling families reunited with long-lost cousins. Instead, the screen flickered, just for a second, like a damaged VHS tape, before displaying a grayscale banner that read, "How human are you? Know the truth." There was something deeply wrong about the wording, something that made my stomach lurch the way it does when you miss a step in the dark, yet before I could close the tab, my thumb was already pressing "Order Now," and for a moment, just a fleeting fraction of a second, I swear I saw my own reflection inside my phone screen, but the face staring back at me wasn't entirely mine. The kit arrived faster than expected, wrapped in thick black plastic that smelled faintly of burning hair and copper, the kind of scent that coats your throat even if you breathe through your mouth. There was no branding, no cheerful welcome packet inside, no sterile medical tone explaining how to swab my cheek, just a slip of paper, badly crumpled, with uneven, almost trembling letters that read, "Do not take the test if you dream in colors you cannot name." I had no idea what that meant, at least, not at the time, but as I stood there under the flickering kitchen light, staring at that warning, my mind involuntarily replayed the dreams I'd had the night before. I couldn't describe the colors if you asked me, because they weren't colors that belonged to this world, or any world I knew. They were shades that hurt to remember, colors that made my brain itch and my vision blur, and the worst part was, I hadn't dreamed in those colors just once. I had dreamed them my whole life, ever since I was a child, ever since my earliest memories. Still, I convinced myself that the warning was a joke, some edgy marketing stunt designed to go viral, the kind of thing that makes teenagers post reaction videos with exaggerated gasps and fake screams. So I swabbed my mouth, sealed the sample inside the tiny sterile tube, and dropped it into the prepaid envelope, but when I looked at my reflection in the kitchen window that night, I noticed my mouth was still open, my tongue resting unnaturally flat, as though it were waiting for something else to enter. The results came faster than I expected, too fast, if I'm being honest, almost like they'd been waiting for me all along, like my DNA wasn't something they had to test at all, but something they already knew, something they'd been tracking since before I was even born. At exactly 3:13 a.m., my phone buzzed, and when I opened the app, the screen was nothing but static at first, a wall of digital snow and shrieking audio feedback that clawed through my speakers loud enough to make my ears bleed. Then the static cleared, replaced by a single line of text that shouldn't have scared me as much as it did, but somehow, it felt like a death sentence. Human, 28%. Beneath it, in bold red letters that throbbed like a wound, unknown, 72%. I stared at the numbers, refreshing the app over and over again, but the percentages flickered every time. Sometimes the human part dropped to 24%, sometimes 17%, and once, just once, it hit 0. My hands shook so badly I dropped my phone, and when I bent down to pick it up, the screen had changed to something else, something worse, a live feed from my front porch camera. I don't even have a front porch camera. But there I was, standing barefoot in the rain, staring directly into the lens, except it wasn't me, not exactly. The thing on the screen wore my face like a mask, stretched too tight, the mouth too wide, the eyes too black, and in its hand, it held a second DNA kit, already dripping with blood. I must have stared at that distorted porch camera feed for at least 5 full minutes, unable to breathe properly, my heart pounding so hard inside my chest that I could hear it vibrating in my skull like the low hum of power lines before a storm, a sound that didn't just fill the air around me but seemed to pulse directly into my bones. My own face, no, the face pretending to be mine, remained perfectly still, its lips curled upward into something that could never be called a smile, the skin around the mouth stretched so thin it looked ready to tear apart with the next twitch. Rainwater poured down its forehead, but the water itself seemed wrong, darker and thicker than rain had any right to be, sliding over the surface of its skin as though afraid to touch it. The hand gripping that second DNA kit was so tight I could see the plastic casing bulging, as if the thing holding it didn't understand the strength it was using or simply didn't care if it shattered. I knew it wasn't me, couldn't be me, because I was standing in my kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile, phone trembling in my hand, but then I glanced down at my feet and saw muddy water pooling around my ankles, and my skin prickled with the impossible realization that somehow, I could still feel the rain. When the screen flickered again, the live feed was gone, replaced by my results once more, but the numbers were no longer fixed the way they should have been, the clean percentage breakdown I expected replaced by a constant, glitching shift between different sets of data, some percentages vanishing before I could even process them, others lingering just long enough to sink hooks into my mind like wet teeth. Human, 28%. That part never changed. But the unknown percentage flickered wildly, 72%, then 85%, then 63%, then a series of symbols I didn't recognize, twisting glyphs that hurt to look at, like my eyes were never meant to see them at all. My throat tightened, stomach rolling with something too deep to be simple fear, something ancient and cellular, like a memory my body had been programmed to forget, until now. Every time I refreshed, the percentages shifted, as if the test wasn't analyzing my DNA in the past tense, but in real time, watching me change, monitoring every breath I took, recalculating me with each passing second. Once, the screen flashed black, and when the text reappeared, it simply said, "Who told you to look?" My phone vibrated violently in my hand, so hard it nearly jumped out of my grip, and the app shut itself down. For a moment, the room was utterly silent except for the rhythmic tapping of water droplets falling from somewhere they shouldn't be, and when I looked up, my kitchen ceiling was leaking a thick, dark liquid that smelled faintly metallic, something between rust and old blood, the same coppery scent I remembered from the packaging of the DNA kit itself. My hands shook so hard I could barely type, but instinct took over, and I tried searching for the company online, hoping to find reviews, warnings, something to explain what was happening, but every search returned nothing, not even a single cached page, like the company had never existed at all. The name itself disappeared from my order history, the confirmation email gone from my inbox, even the charge on my bank account had mutated into something unrecognizable, listing the transaction under a string of nonsense symbols and the date March 13, 1913, a date that should have been impossible. Before I could process that final twist, a sharp knock echoed from the front door, and when I turned toward the sound, I realized the door was already wide open, and my own muddy footprints led from the threshold all the way to where I stood. I didn't sleep that night, because every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, not a voice exactly, but something deeper, wetter, like the sound your own blood might make if it could whisper secrets directly into your skull, secrets so ancient and so wrong that your mind tries to reject them before they fully form. It started as a faint static hum at the base of my neck, just behind my ears, the sort of noise you might dismiss as tinnitus if you weren't already coming apart at the seams, but the longer I lay in the dark, the more the sound sharpened into something almost melodic, a pulsing, rhythmic chant in some unrecognizable language, each syllable sliding under my skin like a cold needle and leaving trails of numbness in its wake. I tried recording it, pressing my phone's microphone against the side of my head just to prove I wasn't imagining it, but when I played the audio back, all I heard was my own breathing, except it wasn't exactly my breath. The inhale was too deep, the exhale too wet, like lungs filled with something thicker than air. It was only when I zoomed in on the audio waveform that I noticed the shapes, buried inside the static, twisting, organic lines that didn't belong in sound at all, patterns that looked alarmingly like veins. I turned on every light in the house, thinking somehow that brightness could push back against the creeping sensation inside me, but no matter how many bulbs I burned, the shadows clung to the edges of every room like something alive, watching, breathing, learning. My hands shook so violently that I knocked over a glass, and when it shattered on the counter, I cut my palm without even noticing until I saw the color of my blood. It wasn't red, not entirely, but a shifting, iridescent shade that flickered between dark oil black and something paler, almost opalescent, like the inside of a seashell rotting under the sun. The blood moved wrong too, not just dripping, but twitching, crawling back toward the cut like it was trying to re-enter my skin, and when it succeeded, the wound sealed itself without pain, leaving only a faint circular scar that looked eerily familiar. I couldn't place where I had seen that shape before, not until I caught my reflection in the dark window over the sink, and there, blooming across my neck like a tattoo I never got, was the exact same mark printed on the DNA kit packaging. Panicking, I ran to the bathroom mirror, needing to see myself under brighter light, needing proof that I was still me, still made of the flesh and bone I had always known, but the person in the mirror didn't move when I did. My reflection stared back with wide, unblinking eyes, mouth slightly open like it was waiting for something to be fed into it, and just for a moment, I saw my own hands, the ones gripping the edges of the sink, split at the seams. Tiny slits opened along the veins in my wrists, not wounds exactly, but something closer to gills, wet and fluttering, pulling at the air as if my skin itself was suffocating. My reflection's lips moved, but I didn't hear my voice. Instead, I heard the same chant that had been crawling through my skull all night, pouring from my own mouth in reverse, each word sliding backward like a cassette tape played the wrong way. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in a silent conversation with whatever I was becoming, but when I finally stepped back, breaking the connection, my reflection stayed exactly where it was, grinning, wide-eyed, watching me leave without turning away. I didn't want to check the cameras. That's the first thing I need you to understand, because anyone listening to this might think I went looking for trouble, that I invited this into my life by feeding my own paranoia, but the truth is, I only opened the security app because my phone vibrated at exactly 3:13 a.m., and the alert said, "Motion detected, front door." The time made me physically sick, because that number had already carved itself into my brain like a jagged scar, and I knew, with the kind of primal certainty you can't rationalize away, that whatever I was about to see would change the shape of reality permanently. The feed opened by itself, as if the app didn't need my permission anymore, and at first, all I saw was rain, sheets of water cascading down the lens, warping the outside world into a blurred, liquid painting. Then the water thinned for just a second, and standing at the edge of my driveway, perfectly still in the downpour, was a figure that shouldn't exist, because it was me. Not a twin, not a shadow, not some coincidental stranger wearing my clothes, but me exactly, down to the tear in my left sleeve and the mud on my shoes, except the face was wrong, stretched too thin, skin too pale, mouth held open as if something inside was trying to crawl out. I screamed, but the sound barely left my throat before the figure snapped its head toward the camera, moving with a speed and violence that made my stomach turn, and the face it showed wasn't quite mine anymore. The eyes were missing, just empty sockets filled with something wet and black, and the skin around its mouth was torn wide open, splitting up to its ears like an old doll's seam coming apart. The figure lifted one hand, slowly, deliberately, and I realized it was holding the DNA kit I had sent in, soaked and dripping, except the liquid running off it wasn't rain. It was thick and dark, tinged with colors that didn't belong in this world, shades that made my vision blur and my thoughts fracture, the same colors I had seen in my dreams. The feed flickered, stuttering frames like old film choking through a broken projector, and in those flashes, the figure moved closer without moving at all, no walking, no footsteps, just a jarring jump forward every time the screen glitched, until suddenly it was standing directly against the lens, forehead pressed so hard to the glass that the skin flattened, veins bulging, mouth still wide open in a silent scream I could somehow hear inside my skull. My phone vibrated again, and the screen split into 4 quadrants, each showing a different angle of my house, the backyard, the side door, the hallway upstairs, and my bedroom. In every single frame, that figure was already there, waiting. I dropped my phone, staggered backward until my spine hit the cold kitchen wall, heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought they might crack, and before I could even think about running, my front door opened on its own. No creak, no dramatic slam, just a quiet, deliberate swing, as though the house itself was inviting something inside. The rain outside stopped instantly, not gradually, but all at once, leaving only silence so thick it pressed against my skin like wet cloth, and that's when I heard the footsteps inside the house, slow and uneven, one foot dragging slightly behind the other, like whatever was moving had forgotten how to walk properly. I couldn't make myself look, couldn't force my neck to turn toward the sound, because some ancient, animal part of me knew that if I saw it, if I made eye contact with whatever was wearing my face, I wouldn't survive the moment. My phone vibrated one final time, and when I looked down, the camera feed had been replaced by a message, written in the same trembling, uneven font that had come with the DNA kit: "You shouldn't have asked who you are." The footstep stopped just behind me, close enough that I could feel its breath, cold, damp, smelling like earth and decay, against the back of my neck. I didn't want to call my family. I think some part of me already knew, even if I couldn't name the knowing yet, even if it was buried deep beneath years of carefully constructed normalcy, a thin shell of suburban reality stretched over something ancient and rotten underneath. But my hands moved before my mind could stop them, fingers dialing my mother's number as though they had memorized it long before I was born. The call rang for exactly 13 seconds before it connected, but the voice on the other end wasn't my mother's, not at first, because the person, the thing, who answered spoke in the same language my blood had been whispering the night before, that wet and broken tongue full of syllables that made my gums ache and my vision pulse in and out of focus like I was standing too close to something radioactive. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't even move as the voice murmured a sequence of words that felt disturbingly familiar despite their alien nature, like something I had heard in a dream so long ago I mistook it for childhood nonsense, something sung over my crib in a melody so soft my conscious mind had forgotten, but my bones had remembered all along. Then the voice snapped back into English, a harsh, panicked whisper that was my mother this time, but trembling so badly it barely sounded human. "You were never supposed to take that test," she said, and before I could respond, the call cut out, replaced by a high-pitched keening noise that made my teeth vibrate in my skull like tuning forks pressed against bone. My mother's house was only a short drive away, but the roads that night felt wrong somehow, too long, too quiet, like every familiar landmark had been subtly rearranged just enough to unsettle me, like the world itself was shrinking or stretching to keep me from getting where I needed to go. The sky was the worst part. I couldn't look at it directly without my eyes watering, because every star seemed just slightly out of place, like they were watching me instead of the other way around, and there was something else up there too, something vast and slow-moving that blotted out sections of the sky in irregular patterns, leaving holes in the stars where nothing should have been. When I finally reached her house, the front door was ajar, and I could see a thin trail of dark liquid leading from the threshold into the dimly lit hallway beyond, not blood exactly, but something thicker, darker, more alive, pulsing faintly in the shadows like a vein torn directly from some enormous, ancient heart. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to pretend none of this was happening, but my feet carried me forward anyway, through the door and into the house where I had grown up, into the mouth of the thing that had been waiting for me all along. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly in front of her like she was waiting for a guest, but her fingernails had all been torn off, leaving her fingertips raw and wet, leaving little smears of iridescent fluid across the wood grain like someone had tried to write in blood but found something older to use instead. She didn't look at me, not directly. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, where a strange circular brand had been burned into the plaster, the exact same symbol I had found beneath my skin, the same shape I had seen inside the DNA kit packaging, the same sigil my blood had formed inside my cut. "It was supposed to skip your generation," my mother whispered, voice hoarse, like someone who had been screaming for hours before I arrived. "We thought if we raised you right, kept you from asking questions, it would stay asleep inside you forever, but you went looking, and now it knows you're awake." She finally turned toward me then, and I saw what had happened to her eyes. They were no longer human at all, no longer anything I could even describe with words, because they weren't eyes anymore but holes punched straight through her skull into someplace else, someplace deeper and hungrier and older than anything human minds were ever meant to comprehend. Something inside her was looking back at me through those holes, something that recognized me even though I had no name for it, something that had been waiting patiently through generations of my bloodline for someone stupid enough to ask what we really were. And now that it knew I was awake, I understood, with the kind of gut-wrenching certainty that only comes when it's far too late, that it wasn't going to let me go back to sleep. I don't remember leaving my mother's house, or getting back into my car, or even driving home, my next clear memory is standing in my own bathroom again, my hands braced against the sink so hard my knuckles had gone bone white, and I was staring at myself, just staring, watching for any flicker, any unnatural twitch, any sign that the thing in the mirror was no longer me. My breath came too fast, hitching and stuttering like I couldn't quite remember how lungs were supposed to work, and my skin felt too tight, as if some invisible thread had been drawn through every pore, pulling me inward, folding me into something smaller, something unfamiliar. That's when I saw the first ripple, a slow undulation beneath the skin of my left forearm, like something was swimming just beneath the surface, pushing outward in rhythmic pulses, each movement spreading a faint glow that lit my veins from the inside out, casting strange shadows beneath my skin that didn't match the bones and muscle I knew should have been there. I pressed my fingers against the bulging vein, trying to feel whatever was moving inside me, and the instant I touched it, my skin split open, not a wound exactly, because there was no pain, only a wet sliding sensation as something pushed its way out through the tear, something that looked almost like a tendril made of my own tissue, but far too smooth, too purposeful, its surface slick and shimmering like it was covered in oil or birth fluid. I should have screamed, but the sound caught in my throat, stuck there like a physical object lodged halfway down, and instead I just watched in mute horror as the tendril coiled around my wrist, not squeezing but feeling, as though it was trying to identify whether or not I was still part of it, or it was part of me. The tendril had a faint pulse, a heartbeat completely out of sync with my own, and the longer it stayed exposed to the air, the more its color changed, from fleshy pink to something darker, something the color of a bruise seen through deep water, until it looked more like a vein ripped from something enormous than any piece of human anatomy. My reflection watched all of this too, with a terrible curiosity, eyes wide and bright, but the mouth, my mouth, was still slightly open, and something inside it was moving, a second tongue perhaps, or something that only looked like a tongue, flickering in and out too fast to follow. When the tendril finally withdrew, sliding back under my skin with obscene ease, the wound sealed itself without a trace, but the skin left behind was no longer entirely mine, it had a faint translucence to it, a subtle glow that pulsed in perfect time with something deeper than my heart, something buried not in my chest, but in my blood itself. Over the next few hours, the changes became impossible to hide, even from myself. The skin along my spine began to separate into segments, splitting neatly along natural folds as though my back had always been meant to open, exposing tissue that shone with a light of its own, a dim, almost bioluminescent glow that flickered in patterns too regular to be random, as though my body was trying to signal something, or respond to a signal I could not yet hear. My fingernails softened, losing their opaque color, turning glassy and flexible, until they peeled away entirely, revealing wet, silver tissue underneath that could extend and retract at will, forming not claws exactly, but tools, shapes designed for purposes my mind could not yet comprehend. Even my teeth were not spared, I felt them loosening one by one, not falling out, but receding, sliding backward into my gums like they were being absorbed, until what remained was something softer, something that could reshape itself depending on what I needed to consume. I no longer recognized the face in the mirror, not because it had changed beyond recognition, but because it had become too fluid, the bones beneath the skin capable of shifting, the very structure of my skull adjusting itself to better fit whatever came next. My humanity wasn't just leaving me, it was being rewritten, line by line, cell by cell, turning me into something I was always meant to become. It started with the sound, a low, rhythmic knock that came not from the front door, or the windows, or even the walls, but from inside the house itself, somewhere deep within the structure, like it had been hiding there all along, breathing alongside me, waiting for the exact moment when my blood would betray me. I stood perfectly still in the middle of my living room, listening as the knock grew louder, more deliberate, a steady pulse that seemed to sync perfectly with the glow flickering beneath my skin, each knock a match to the strange, sickening heartbeat now pulsing through my veins. The air inside the house turned thick, heavy like breathing through a wet cloth, every breath leaving a metallic taste on my tongue, and even though I couldn't see anything at first, I could feel them, shapes moving just outside the edge of my vision, shadows stretching too far from corners they had no right to crawl from, like the house itself had grown extra rooms just to make space for them. When the knock came again, it wasn't alone, this time, it was accompanied by a soft, wet whisper, a voice I knew without ever having heard it before, calling me by a name I had never been given, a name that didn't belong to any human throat, a name meant only for whatever I was becoming. I didn't want to look outside, but my feet carried me toward the window, body moving with the strange, puppet-like certainty of someone following instructions carved directly into their bones. Through the glass, I saw the first of them, tall, skin stretched impossibly tight across too many joints, their arms too long, legs too thin, heads cocked to the side like curious animals dissecting something helpless, but the worst part was their faces, or rather the absence of them. They had no eyes, no mouths, no features at all, just smooth, wet skin stretched over the blank shape of a skull, but somehow I knew they could see me perfectly, not just my body but everything inside me, every secret my blood had ever carried, every mutation my family had tried to suppress, every scrap of ancient knowledge waking up cell by cell inside me. Their heads twitched in unison, all of them turning slightly toward the house like a compass needle snapping north, and without moving their legs, they glided forward, the ground beneath them blistering and smoking as though the earth itself rejected their touch. As they approached, my own body reacted against my will, my fingers curled into strange shapes, skin along my spine splitting open once again to reveal that pulsating symbol etched into my flesh, but this time, the light pouring from it wasn't my own, it was theirs, a sick, shuddering pulse that matched the rhythm of the knock, the whisper, the blood chant inside my skull. The front door opened without my permission, the lock turning with a soft wet pop like something organic instead of metal, and before I could scream, they were inside, standing shoulder to shoulder in my hallway, so tall their heads scraped the ceiling, leaving trails of dark, viscous fluid staining the plaster wherever they touched. They didn't walk toward me, they melted forward, each step a strange liquid slide, their bodies half solid, half fluid, like skin draped over something unfinished, constantly reshaping itself just to hold its own form together. One of them raised a hand, fingers too long and jointed in all the wrong places, and pressed it flat against my chest, the skin there burning ice cold under its touch, but instead of pain, I felt something worse, recognition, a horrifying sense of belonging, as though my body had been designed to fit perfectly beneath that alien hand, like a key slipping into its lock after years of wandering without a door. The whispering grew louder until it wasn't just inside my head anymore, it was inside my blood, inside my bones, each cell vibrating with words that had no translation in any human language, but I understood them anyway, because they weren't talking to my mind, they were talking directly to my genetic code, waking up every secret my ancestors had buried beneath layers of human skin, and with each whisper, I felt myself unraveling, losing shape, becoming something closer to them. And worst of all, I didn't want to stop it, because in that moment, surrounded by creatures that had no right to exist, I realized I was the one who had summoned them, and they had finally come to bring me home. By the time my hands stopped shaking enough to type, dawn was bleeding weakly through the windows, but the sunlight brought no comfort, because the sky itself looked wrong, the shade too pale, the clouds too still, like a painted backdrop barely holding together behind the weight of whatever had forced its way into my house the night before. My skin still tingled where they touched me, not pain exactly, but something much worse, a sensation that felt like my cells were rearranging themselves beneath the surface, adapting to fit a design that wasn't meant for human bodies at all. I opened my laptop and started searching for Beyond Ancestry, the DNA company whose test had started all of this, but every search came up empty, no website, no reviews, no corporate filings, nothing. Even the confirmation email they'd sent me was gone, wiped from my inbox like it had never existed, and the charge on my credit card had been replaced by a meaningless string of symbols that hurt to look at, characters that flickered between language and something alive, letters that seemed to breathe if I stared too long. I even called my bank, desperate for some human explanation, but the representative didn't recognize the merchant name, couldn't trace the transaction back to any legitimate business, and then, just before she transferred me to a supervisor, the call cut out, replaced by a familiar sound, that same wet, whispering voice I'd heard through my mother's phone, speaking directly into my ear, saying my name in a tone so intimate and wrong it made my teeth ache in my gums. I wasn't thinking straight when I drove to the address printed on the original packaging. I don't even remember getting into my car, or grabbing the crumpled shipping label from the trash, but somehow I found myself standing outside the building, heart slamming so hard against my ribs I could feel my vision vibrating at the edges. The building was wrong, even from a distance. It stood at the end of a crumbling industrial park, surrounded by rusted fences that hadn't been opened in years. The windows were all blacked out from the inside, and the air smelled like something between burnt hair and old seawater, that same metallic scent I'd noticed on the DNA kit itself. There was no signage, no indication that any kind of business had ever operated here, just a narrow door with a symbol burned into the metal, the same sigil carved into my skin, the same shape my blood had formed that first night, and the moment I touched the door handle, I felt it, a low vibration, something beneath the earth, something enormous breathing beneath my feet, like the entire structure was a lung, inhaling and exhaling slowly, patiently, waiting for me to step inside. The door swung open before I could turn away, revealing a room that shouldn't exist, a space too large to fit inside the building's exterior footprint, walls lined with flesh-like material stretched so thin it was practically transparent, and behind that membrane, something moved, not walking or crawling, but pressing outward as though the walls themselves were pregnant with something enormous, something that had been waiting a very long time to be born. There were no desks, no computers, no sign of human work ever having been done inside, only a shrine standing in the center of the room, built from bones and hair and twisted metal, all fused together into a towering column that pulsed faintly, a heartbeat made of stolen parts, and embedded within that shrine, at eye level, was a photograph of me. Not a recent photo, not even one from my childhood, but an ultrasound image, my own fetal form curled inside the womb, except there was something wrong with the image, something else inside the amniotic sac with me, a second shape barely visible behind my developing spine, something with too many fingers and no face at all, and scrawled beneath the image, in what I knew instantly was my mother's handwriting, were the words, "We thought we could hide you." Before I could scream, before I could even process what I was seeing, the floor collapsed beneath me, or maybe the shrine itself opened, splitting like a mouth swallowing me whole, and as I fell into the dark, my skin began to glow again, that same bioluminescent pulse matching the heartbeat of the thing waiting at the bottom, the thing I knew without question had created me, not out of love, not out of biology, but out of some ancient contract, some blood pact between whatever I was and the thing now crawling up my throat, ready to take my voice, my body, my life, and finish what my bloodline started long before humans had names for fear. When I woke, I wasn't on solid ground anymore, and for several disoriented moments, my brain couldn't even process which way was up, because there was no up, only a thick, clinging void that held me like liquid night, dense and breathing, wrapping around my limbs like a second skin that was somehow both inside and outside of me at once. My body floated, suspended in something that felt like fluid memory, every inch of my skin tingling with sensation I had no name for, because what touched me wasn't air, or water, or anything that belonged to the human world, but a substance closer to consciousness itself, a living archive pressing directly into my pores, pushing ancient knowledge into the cells of my muscle and bone. When I tried to scream, my mouth filled with that same substance, thick and warm, and instead of drowning, my throat opened wider, jaw unhinging far beyond what human anatomy should allow, and I felt my entire face stretch into a shape I didn't recognize, as though my skull had remembered its original form, a shape not meant for mirrors or photographs, but for something older, something made to navigate the spaces between worlds, where eyes were unnecessary and names were only vibrations. Inside the blood. The process didn't hurt, at least not in any way pain had ever made sense to me before, but it was intimate to the point of violation, like my body was being unwritten and rewritten simultaneously, every memory I had of being human peeled away layer by layer, until the timeline of my life became nothing more than a temporary disguise draped over something much older and much hungrier beneath. My fingers stretched first, the bones lengthening into delicate, claw-like appendages, skin thinning into translucent webbing, nerves exposed and pulsing with light that flickered in sequences I somehow understood, communication stripped of language, reduced to the purest form of biological intention. My spine was next, every vertebra unfolding like a spiral staircase, new segments emerging from nowhere, each one coated in a slick, membranous substance that evaporated almost instantly, filling the air with the sharp, metallic scent of birth fluid and burning stars. My skin tore along every major seam, wrists, throat, ribcage, but instead of bleeding, the wounds glowed, edges curling back like petals, opening to reveal something underneath that had been hiding inside me my entire life, something that wasn't flesh at all, but a smooth, chitinous material, hard and cold, etched with symbols that moved as though they were alive, twisting and writhing in rhythm with my pulse. The whispers in my blood were no longer whispers, they were instructions, ancient directives flowing directly from whatever intelligence had designed me into the conscious framework of my remade body, every bone, every nerve, every strand of genetic material tuned to a frequency I could now hear with terrifying clarity. I was no longer just me, I was a key, a biological beacon calling out across dimensions, broadcasting my location to things that had no names, entities that existed outside time, whose arrival depended entirely on my awakening. My mother had tried to hide me, wrapping me in layers of human tradition, burying my ancestral biology beneath school pictures and birthday cakes and medical records, but the moment I opened the DNA test, the moment I asked the question no one in my bloodline was allowed to ask, I triggered the recall process, an ancient fail-safe encoded into my very bones, a signal flare designed to pierce through the illusion of reality, letting them know their lost one was awake at last. My transformation wasn't punishment, or even evolution, it was simply a return to the form I was always meant to wear, the form that fit the space between this world and theirs, and with every breath, every stretch of my shifting skin, I understood the truth my family had spent generations trying to deny. I was never human at all, I was a sleeper agent wrapped in flesh, waiting for the day my creators would come to claim me. I always thought memories were something you collected, snapshots of birthdays, smells of old houses, the sting of skin knees on hot pavement, but now I know memories can be planted, too, like seeds buried inside flesh, designed to grow only when the right signal calls them awake. My life wasn't a timeline, it was a cover story, stitched into my mind the way a taxidermist stuffs glass eyes into a dead thing's skull, carefully posed to appear real until someone looks too closely. Every birthday candle I ever blew out, every school photo taped to the fridge, every scraped knee and crooked smile, all of it existed only to disguise the truth that I was not my parents' child at all, not even a child of this world, but a vessel grown from borrowed bones, human only in shape, designed to house something older, something that needed to wear my face to walk unnoticed in human skin. The DNA test wasn't a mistake or even a discovery, it was a summons, a trigger hidden inside my cells, waiting patiently for curiosity to override survival, for me to reach into my own bloodline and pull the roots out by hand, exposing what had been hiding underneath all along. When the recall process finished, I was no longer alone inside my body, no longer singular in my thoughts or my voice, because every ancestor who had carried this infection before me, every mother who had hidden it, every father who had feared it, every child who had felt its pulse beneath their skin and forced themselves to forget, they were all awake now, speaking through my bones, guiding my hands, sharing my eyes. They had all fought at once, tried to resist the ancient pull, the command written into our very marrow, the command to return, to merge, to complete the cycle our species had been designed for when it was first planted here, long before humans stood upright, long before language polluted the purity of the call. We were not immigrants to this planet, not invaders or parasites, but seeds deliberately sown into the first bloodlines, genetic time bombs waiting for a future date when the harvest would begin. Every few generations, one of us would wake up, our body remembering what our minds had been conditioned to forget, and when that happened, the harvesters would come, the faceless watchers I had seen through my window, the blind midwives who guided us back to what we truly were, tearing away the human disguise until the creature underneath could finally breathe again. My family had spent generations running from this truth, changing names, moving towns, burying records, but blood remembers, even when you lie to it, and the moment I opened the kit, I might as well have cut my own throat, because they felt me wake up, and nothing could stop what came next. I am not writing this to warn you, there is no warning that can save you if you were planted like me, no superstition strong enough, no prayer old enough to seal your skin shut once the blood begins to sing. I am writing this because I want you to understand what's really inside those kits they mail to your door, what you are really asking when you swab your mouth and demand to know who you are, because the truth is, you might not want the answer, and once you know it, you can never unknow it. The human race is not the only species on this planet, and we never were. We were grown, cultivated in human fields the way you might plant wildflowers among crops to keep the soil fertile, our DNA interwoven with something older, hungrier, something that needed to look human just long enough to get back inside. And now, I can feel it under my skin, deeper than muscle or bone, something pushing outward, ready to shed this final disguise, because my recall isn't just personal, it's global, and when they come for me, they'll come for all the others too. If you've ever taken a DNA test and felt the results were wrong, if you've ever looked into a mirror and thought your reflection was slower than you were, if you've ever heard a hum inside your veins when the house was silent, you were planted too. And now that I've written this, now that you've read it, they know you're awake, and nothing can stop them from coming to collect you next.